Dear students, welcome to UGC EPG Patashala on Human Rights and Duties. My name is Professor Y.S.R. Murthy. I am the Executive Director for the Center for Human Rights Studies, OP Jindal Global University. In this paper on philosophical foundations of human rights, duties and responsibilities, we will take up today the module on feminist critique to human rights. As we have seen, human rights are universal. There is a UN Charter which has been adopted, which in its preamble as well as Article 1 about the aims of the United Nations guarantees everyone human rights and fundamental freedom, regardless of any distinctions. And all countries of the world have signed that. And in the same vein, Universal Declaration of Human Rights has also been adopted by the UN General Assembly, and all countries of the world have accepted it. And there is a list of rights. So in a one sense, human rights are universal, yet there are critiques to the notion of universality. There are two strands of cultural relativist critique, one in the form of Islamic critique and the other in the form of Asian values critique, and there is one more critique from the feminist side to the notion of human rights, and which will be the subject matter of this module. So when we discuss philosophical foundations, it's very important that we understand this feminist legal challenge to the notion of human rights, and what are the learning objectives for this module. What do we seek to achieve? At the end of this module, you will learn about the feminist perspective to human rights. You will also learn about how public-private divide in the international law hampered the enjoyment of women's rights. You will also understand the emerging feminist movement to transform women's rights issues into human rights issue, and the significance of the feminist movement and the effective changes it has brought. The contemporary idea, notion or understanding of human rights came into existence after the Second World War. The Allied powers who emerged victorious had maintained that the reason for their inclusion in the war effort was the protection of human rights. The end of Second World War saw the emergence of United Nations, which was set up with the main purpose of acting as a promoter of human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, was seen as the Magna Carta of the contemporary international human rights. Numerous conventions and covenants have derived their authority from it. Human rights are not an abstract idea, but claims which are essential for every human being to live with dignity, decency and fairness. They are so essential to a person's well-being that they are considered as immunities for a person against the government. To call such rights as human implies that they are universal and belong to every human being in every society. They are not limited by geography, gender, history, culture, birth or any such classification. Human rights are obligation on the state which it has to fulfill or to provide remedies to people whose rights are violated. They are an entitlement of every human being, and thus everyone must respect them. If you look at Article 2 of the UDHR, it asserts that the rights and freedoms set forth in the declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status shall be enjoyed by everyone. Since 1948, the world community has discussed many facets of human rights, but these debates have not paid adequate attention to gender. The last 2 decades have witnessed a major surge in the development of women's rights due to the development of the ideology of feminism. This includes vast writing on women's issues, their rights, and their protection. The UN has played a major role in giving a fillip to such writings. These articles also criticize the role of international law in protecting women's rights. The concept of human rights is never static but ever expanding one. In this view, the feminist critique of human rights have an ultimate aim to redefine, re-envision human rights through the specific lived experiences to transform their practice so that they can take a better account of women's issues. The foundation of the modern notion of human rights can be seen in the Western society, which makes them highly contested. Human rights emerged as a result of certain political, economic, and social conditions. The feminist critique of human rights argues that the motive behind recognizing the notions of human rights was political as well as gendered. It mainly revolves around the argument that the construction of human rights law is unsatisfactory for women because it reflects a male point of view. The feminist criticizes the public-private divide in the international human rights law. The private aspect in which most women are relegated is beyond state control, and thus it makes women vulnerable. Now let us focus our attention on the historical context. In the sphere of international law, state is a subject. States only participate on behalf of the individuals who are a part of the state in the international norm making, international norm creation. However, after the Second World War, human rights protection took a center stage as it was realized that the states are unable to adequately protect its individuals. Thus, in a paradigm shift, the international human rights law became more and more centered on the individual. With the development in the feminist ideology in the 80s, laws were analyzed from a feminist perspective like other social sciences, which raised the fundamental questions about very nature of the law. Though the influence of the ideology of feminism first had an impact on laws specifically relating to women like family law, equal remuneration, and reproductive right, slowly and gradually it started influencing the criminal law and constitutional law to transform these laws and make them gender neutral. The development of international human rights law is seen in a very optimistic way given its huge potential to protect the life and dignity of every human being. It's a different matter though that this very idea of human rights has been criticized when it claims that such notions of human rights are universal and neutral. The main criticism is from two sections. One, the cultural relativists who claim that human rights are not universal but relative to a culture and they are applied in. Second, the feminists who argue that human rights are not neutral but male biased. The feminist critique argues that the international human rights law has been so developed that it ignores the concerns of women and has limited itself to responding to problems as and when they appear. Thus, the feminist view the notion of human rights as political and pious. Friedman states that, I quote, law respect and reinforces the interests of particular group in society. These interests have always been predominantly male, unquote. Human rights laws have been created by people who are dominantly male, and hence it is reflected in the law they framed. For example, the absence of female pronoun. Some critics have also described such law so framed as international men's law. Charles Worth argues that, and I quote, issues traditionally of concern to men are seen as general human concerns. Women concerns, by contrast, are regarded as a distinct and limited category. Feminist method of criticism is based on practical reasoning rather than on philosophical reasons. Their method begins from actual human experience and the problems they suffer. Such real life experiences are theorized by the feminist critique. Feminist ideology never functions in an isolated fashion but is interlinked with the contemporary social, political, and economic problems. Thus, this critique provides a very objective picture to the problem. Feminist critique poses a great challenge to the contemporary notion of human rights. These include the definition of human rights, the adjudication process, as well as their enforcement. The most important aspect of this criticism is that threat to subject matter of what is being protected by the human rights jurisprudence. It also challenges the working of legal institutions for human rights, terming them as incapable and exclusionary. Public-private bifurcation of human rights law. This division of human rights law into public law and private law is central to the feminist critique of human rights. Such a division is not only restricted to human rights law but central to Western liberal thought. The problem that such a division poses to women is that it is formed parallel to the development of the idea of state, which is to be the guardian of all the people living in it, both men and women. This public-private division is based upon the idea that an individual's life can be divided into two spheres. The first is the domestic sphere, which is mainly the sphere of women, and the second is the world outside, which is the sphere of men. Such spheres are divided on the basis of gender role stereotyping. Women are supposed to take care of the home and children and thus are restricted to the domestic sphere. And the evolution of male gender as the primary bread earner has made the outside sphere the domain of men. This public-private division is a contested one. The domestic sphere is the personal zone of the individual and remains largely outside the state control, regulated by customs and cultural norms, and the rest of the outside sphere is the civil and political society where social norms made by the state comes into play. For example, states are reluctant in intervening in the cases of domestic violence, but they easily intervene in the matters of family planning and abortion laws, which violate the right to privacy of a woman. Feminist critique also observes that non-Western societies, which criticizes the universalization of human rights, that is Islamic critique and the Asian values critique, have no objection to the neutrality of human rights law. It is ironic as these societies witness the maximum violation of women's rights. The reason for it can be seen in the public-private bifurcation. These societies have a concept of extended families and give more preference to community rather than individual, which makes the private sphere very wide. McQuigg rightly observes that, I quote, women were more directly oppressed by their families than by their governments, although government inaction facilitate the perpetuation of that oppression. International law's priority of the state over civil society and of civil and political rights over social and economic rights represent and constitute structural bias against women. Another sphere of the feminist critique of human rights is the preference of civil and political rights over economic, cultural and social rights. The narrow definition of human rights advanced by some countries solely relies on violation of civil and political rights. There is a considerable concern, hue and cry, when a person is beaten to death for expressing his political ideas in comparison to the reaction people have when a woman is beaten to death. This is overlooked by the state as well as the community. The main reason for it is again that the private sphere is not governed by the state, by rituals and cultures which are patriarchal in nature. Some important aspects of women's rights do not fit into civil liberties because it is a part of socio-economic conditions. Y.S.R argues that the issue is what types of private acts are and are not protected by the right to privacy and or the principle of family autonomy. Even more specifically, the issue is whether violations on human rights within the family, such as genital mutilation, wife beating and other forms of violence designed to maintain patriarchal control, should be within the purview of human rights theory and action. The underlying problem of human rights theory, as for most other fields of theory, is that the yardstick has been developed for defining and measuring human rights has been based on the male as the norm. Thus, you see that there is a need to move beyond such male defined norms by the human rights community so that it can effectively respond to the violation of women's rights. There is also need to examine patriarchal biases and acknowledge women's rights is not a distinctive subject but a part of human rights, and thus every state has the right to intervene in it. Now, let us see how women's rights have evolved into human rights. Eminent feminist legal scholar Charlotte Bunch laments the fact that, and I quote, despite a clear record of deaths and demonstrable abuse, women's rights are not commonly classified as human rights. Women have been discriminated on account of their gender. Often, governments have taken a stand that abuse of women, while regrettable, is a cultural, private or individual issue and not a political matter requiring state action. Charlotte Bunch again points out that such abuses, although committed perhaps by private citizens, are often condoned or even sanctioned by states. Citing sex selection, female feticide, discrimination in access to health, education, and other rights, violence against women, she observes that, I quote, sexism kills. There is increasing documentation of the many ways in which being female is life threatening, unquote. Mounting a feminist legal challenge to the existing structures, she points out that sex discrimination, when combined with race, class, and other forms of oppression, it constitutes a deadly denial of women's right to life and liberty on a large scale throughout the world. The most pervasive violation of females is violence against women in all its manifestations, from wife battery to incest and rape to dowry deaths, genital mutilation, and female sexual slavery. These abuses occur in every country and are found in the home and in the workplace, on streets, on campuses, and in prisons and refugee camps. They cross class, race, age, and national lines. And at the same time, the forms this violence takes often reinforce other oppressions such as racism, able-bodyism, and imperialism, referring to domination and structural relations of power and privilege as being responsible for gender-based violence. She argues that, and I quote, contrary to the argument that such violence is only personal or cultural, it is profoundly political. Violence against women is central to maintaining those political relations at home, at work, and in all public spheres. The women's rights is treated as a different subject than the human rights. However, it is very well a part of it. Such classification has resulted in practical consequences for women. This distinction has led to the evolution of an idea that gives greater emphasis to human rights than women's rights. For example, the Commission on Human Rights Council or the Human Rights Commission on the United Nations has greater power than the Commission on the Status of Women with respect to investigation, budget, staff, and other such aspects. Feminists criticize this classification and argue that women's rights are very well or indeed a part of human rights, and thus similar emphasis should be accorded to both of them. Such an argument has four approaches. There is one political and civil approach, which is based on recognizing women's violations as part of a recognized political and civil liberties, and hence increasing the visibility of women who suffer such violations. For instance, violence against women can be recognized along with political and civil rights violations as sexual torture of women political prisoners. This approach not only helps in raising women's concerns but also addressing them. This approach places the women's rights equivalent to human rights and thus makes it more visible to human rights groups. Second is a socio-economic approach. This approach strikes at the predominance given to civil and political rights and argues that political rights are meaningless in the absence of economic rights. It focuses on economic rights of women and an end to their vulnerability to violence. It has succeeded in getting attention to women's right to organize, opposition to violence at workplace, feminization of poverty, which argues that higher proportion of the poor are females, land ownership, access to credit. However, this approach is limited to women's economic development, presuming that such development will end violence towards women and promote their rights. The development of women is very much needed to end their vulnerability, but it should encompass political, economic, and cultural empowerment. Third, let us see law on women's rights approach. This approach calls for state to take responsibility for protection of women's rights and create laws for them. The existing laws which deals with sex determination and violence are an example of such approach. This approach is a way to expand state responsibility to private sphere. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, was adopted by the UN General Assembly in the year 1979 and ratified by nearly 178 countries. These countries are to report to the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women on their compliance. This convention has a clear and definite human rights agenda for women, but the limitation of this document is its little power to make its principles implemented. It is still treated as a document relating to women's rights and not human rights. Now let us turn our attention to transformation of human rights from women's perspective. In this approach, there is an attempt to transform human rights from a feminist perspective. It seeks to address violation of women's rights by seeking a change in human rights concept and making it more responsive to the problem of women. This approach asks some very pertinent questions relating to human rights, like who defines human rights? Who has the authority to decide what can be included in human rights or not? A panel of the 1990 International Women's Rights Action Watch Conference asserted that, and I quote, "Violence against women is a human rights issue." In conclusion, the basic foundation of human rights is equality, that every person shall be treated with equality and dignity. The feminist critique of human rights is particularly significant because of the practical approach of such criticism. It flows directly from the lived experiences of the oppressed. The feminist perspective of human rights hit at the very basic foundation of human rights, that true meaning of equality is not being treated same, but being given equal freedom and opportunity by making the existing legal institutions more flexible. Feminist methodology is not only significant with respect to human rights, but for any social system. By looking at the experiences of women, it becomes easier to challenge the existing notion of human rights and their violations in specific culture. The discussion on feminist ideology have provided a framework where discussion on giving priority to women's rights over the right to culture has been possible. Another significant achievement of the feminist critique is stirring the discussions on the generalizations of human rights violations. Feminists have hit at the very core of such generalization and have explained that the violations of women are different from violations of men. The torture inflicted on a female political prisoner is very different from the one inflicted on a male political prisoner. Feminist critique has placed an oppressed group at the forefront of the human rights debate, and it is because of such critique that now even with the oppressed groups of marginalized sections and refugees, a greater voice is being accorded to the experience of women. Feminist perspective of human rights has challenged the institutional arrangements, sought answers to various questions, and suggested pragmatic solutions to the present problem. It has thus succeeded in providing the picture of an alternate vision relevant to the contemporary society. Thank you.